A biting winter wind howled across the Rockies. Inside the vast, minimalist great room of the Ironwood estate, Ethan Vance savored a measure of bourbon, the firelight glinting off the crystal tumbler. A man approached, his footsteps silent on the polished concrete floor. He reported that Julian Hayes was at the main gate, asking to be admitted. Ethan set his glass down on the heavy oak table with deliberate slowness, a question forming in his mind about whether Julian had come alone. The subordinate answered, his voice low and unsettled, that Julian wasn't by himself. He had the young master with him, the boy, and the child appeared to be sick. Ethan listened to the storm raging outside, and a faint smile touched his lips, softening the usually severe lines of his face. He gave the order for Julian to wait outside in the snow, and that he should be brought in after an hour had passed. He watched his man leave without a flicker of hesitation, and the smile on his face deepened. He lifted the bourbon to his lips, inhaling the aroma before taking a slow sip. He had anticipated this day for a very long time. Everything that had once belonged to Julian Hayes was now his. The reputation, the fortune, the power, and this formidable mountain fortress itself. And Julian, who had always carried himself with the unattainable grace of a distant cloud, was finally about to bow his proud head. The glass was empty. Ethan poured another. He wanted to fully immerse himself in the flavor of this moment. When Julian was finally escorted in, Ethan was settled comfortably in a large leather armchair, looking down at him from a raised section of the room. He observed that Julian's clothing was thin and inadequate for the weather. His pale face was tinged with blue from the cold, his lips a deep violet. His hair, which he always wore impeccably styled, was a chaotic mess, whipped into disarray by the wind during his long wait. Julian clutched a small child of about 3 or 4, wrapped tightly in a frayed overcoat. Only a small, gaunt face was visible, the boy's breaths coming in ragged gasps, his eyes shut tight. Julian's own expression was surprisingly composed. Even as his gaze swept over the familiar space, a place where he had grown up and which he had lost, he showed no trace of lingering attachment or embarrassment. He walked toward Ethan. After a moment of slight hesitation, a sharp kick to the back of each knee sent him stumbling to the floor. Ethan glanced at the 2 guards who had brought him in. They had been with him for years and understood his unspoken commands. The blows had been subtle, but Ethan knew they would have been intensely painful. Julian knelt unsteadily, a sheen of cold sweat quickly forming on his forehead. His vision swam, and he could barely make out Ethan's features. He had been so frozen that his voice wouldn't work, and his body was still reeling from the sudden shift between extreme cold and sharp pain. The child in his arms was a constant, desperate reminder of why he was here. He carefully laid the boy on the thick rug, his lips trembling for a moment before he managed to form words, enunciating each one with difficulty. He asked Ethan to please save him. Ethan languidly crossed one leg over the other, the movement a picture of refined arrogance. He questioned why he should save Julian's dying son, remarking that Julian himself was worthless, so what possible benefit could there be? He knew Julian well, knew precisely which words would cut the deepest. As expected, Julian's body flinched. He looked up, his eyes holding a dazed, uncomprehending expression. Ethan smiled, his voice deceptively gentle as he asked if this was truly how one begged for a favor. He suggested Julian take his son and leave, complaining that they were soiling his floor. He added that if they were going to die, they should do it somewhere else, as he had no intention of arranging for the disposal of their bodies. Julian stared at Ethan's indifferent expression, a bitter curve touching his lips. He slowly bent forward, pressing his forehead to the ground. He acknowledged his own destitution, his physical skills gone, his finances ruined. He admitted he had nothing of value to offer. But he reasoned that since Ethan had agreed to see him at all, there must be something about him that Ethan still desired. Ethan's voice remained mild, but his smile morphed into open mockery. He told Julian that he knew he was at his wit's end but was still clinging to a sliver of hope. That, he explained, was the very reason he had allowed him inside, to waste his time talking. He wanted the satisfaction of telling Julian to his face that even if he were to bash his own head against the floor until he died, Ethan would not lift a finger to save the boy. The words had been buried in Ethan's heart for years, and finally speaking them felt like a profound release, a catharsis that seemed to dissipate some of the long-festering bitterness within him. Julian's body swayed. He looked at Ethan with disbelief, his expression slowly hardening into a numb despair. He gently reached for his child, his gaze filled with apology and sorrow. He struggled to his feet and turned away without another glance at Ethan. Ethan watched him go. The loss of his formidable physical conditioning and the hardships of the past few years had whittled him down. His back was no longer the straight, confident line it once was. They were the same age, just 27, but adversity had stripped away Julian's brilliance, leaving behind a desolate weariness. For some reason, Ethan's mind conjured an image of the Julian from years ago, a man so perfect he inspired an urge to destroy him. The Hayes dynasty had always produced strikingly handsome heirs, and Julian had been the pinnacle, possessing a luminous quality even as a teenager that brought to mind phrases about flawless jade and perfect pearls. Ethan remembered a trip with Julian to New Orleans. They had gone to a smoky club in the French Quarter to hear the blues. The legendary singer, a woman who never left her stage, had come down to their table, her guitar in her arms, and sang a song just for him, every note and every glance a tribute to Julian's beauty. Ethan could still recall the lyrics, something about a lonesome cottage and hearing the spring rain all night. When the song ended, Julian had just smiled, tossed a few magnolia blossoms into the singer's empty glass, and then pulled Ethan out into the misty rain without a word, his coat billowing behind him like a lotus blooming on the riverbank. He had said that such a perfect southern rain was too romantic to be wasted indoors, and that they should find a quiet place to drink together, a quiet place to listen to the spring rain all night. Julian was a proud man, exceptionally proud. It was that pride that made his affection so intoxicating, potent enough to make one forget the world, to forget one's own identity. Years had passed, seasons had turned, storms had raged, and the Julian of that time was gone. Wasn't the point of all this, the humiliation, the torment, cornering him until he had nowhere left to turn, to force him to bow? Was there truly nothing left to gain? What Ethan couldn't comprehend was why, no matter how cruelly he was treated, Julian's first reaction was always that bewildered, disbelieving look, as if he were asking why, as if there had been no betrayal, no abandonment. Ending it like this felt deeply unsatisfying. As Julian walked toward the door, Ethan spoke suddenly, offering to save his child. Julian stopped. The moment the words left his mouth, Ethan felt a weight lift from his own shoulders, so he didn't bother to analyze his change of heart. As for the conditions, he stated that Julian would remain at Ironwood and work as one of the staff. And so Julian stayed, living in a small room next to the boiler room. His duties, aside from chopping wood for the fireplaces and hauling supplies, included servicing Ethan's collection of classic cars. Ethan kept his promise, providing the best medical care for the boy, whose name was Leo, but he never allowed Julian to see him. In the 3 years since Ethan had taken control of the estate, many of the original staff had been replaced with people loyal to him. The remaining servants were cowed into silence. No one spoke to Julian. Julian had once been the master here, but his aloof nature meant he had paid little attention to the staff, barely knowing any of them by name. For those who remained, he was an awkward presence. He could no longer be respected. It was obvious how much the new master detested him, nor could he be befriended. He was a fallen king, physically broken, living on the charity of his usurper, with no chance of ever rising again. So the more decent among them simply ignored him. Those with more ambition saw an opportunity and made a point of subtly tormenting him, hoping to catch Ethan's favorable attention and climb the ladder. Ethan observed all of this with a quiet, cold satisfaction. Julian had been born here, had grown up as the center of this universe, a dazzling figure. So it was fitting that here, in this same place, the daily corrosion of isolation and betrayal would grind away what little pride and dignity he had left. Ethan intended to return to Julian, piece by piece, every ounce of suffering he himself had endured. The closest things Julian had to companions were the cars, especially a vintage Shelby Cobra, a gleaming machine of silver and blue. It had been Julian's favorite, and it seemed to remember him, the engine rumbling with a unique timbre whenever he was near. One evening at dusk, after finishing his work for the day, Ethan took a walk through the gardens and felt a sudden urge to drive. Not bothering to call for an attendant, he walked toward the main garage. As he approached, he saw Julian, dressed in worn-out work clothes, carefully polishing the Cobra's chrome. The car seemed to hum under his touch, and a faint, gentle smile graced Julian's lips. Ethan stopped some distance away, watching. Julian's face had grown thinner, more careworn in recent weeks. Yet that smile was exactly as Ethan remembered it from long ago. In the pale gold of the twilight, it had a breathtaking clarity. For a moment, Ethan genuinely held his breath. When he came to his senses, an inexplicable rage surged through him. He didn't know its source and didn't care to. His face a mask of fury, he strode forward, snatched a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox, and brought it down with all his strength on the Cobra's fender. Julian cried out in surprise and instinctively threw himself in front of the car. His reflexes were still sharp, but his injured body lacked its former precision and strength. The wrench, meant for the car, glanced off his cheek and struck him hard on the right shoulder, tearing through his jacket and shirt. For a moment, neither of them moved. Julian was clearly in extreme pain, his brow furrowed. It was the same slight furrowing of his brow that Ethan remembered from the day he had thrown him out of Ironwood, penniless, with an infant in his arms. Blood welled from the gash on his face, forming dark beads that rolled down his colorless cheek and disappeared into his collar. Julian spoke, his voice calm. He stated that the car didn't understand human affairs. He told Ethan that since he was the master now, he should direct his anger at him, adding that it was unseemly for the staff to witness such outbursts. The words were like gasoline on a fire. Ethan's anger intensified, though he still couldn't understand its source. He only remembered that Julian had once gifted him a similar car, long ago. He swung the wrench again, striking Julian's other shoulder. Then he grabbed the Cobra's keys from a hook, his face cold and impassive, got in, and roared out of the garage. Being the master here meant he could do as he pleased, punish whomever he wished. That was the entire point. The next day, Ethan had Julian reassigned from the garage to the laundry. The incident had been witnessed by another mechanic, and the staff of Ironwood were once again reminded of just how determined their calm, composed employer was to torment Julian Hayes. Why else would he go to such lengths? And so the casual taunts and deliberate difficulties Julian faced escalated. Whether it was hauling supplies or washing linens, the work was all in the outer service buildings. For a while, Ethan didn't see Julian, though he would sometimes hear reports from the staff about his hardships. He would listen with a faint smile, never commenting, never intervening, except to quietly reassign any servant who showed Julian the slightest bit of kindness to a more arduous post. As for the young maid who had promised to sneak a picture of Leo to Julian, Ethan had her beaten and thrown out. Sometimes Ethan wondered why he bothered with such petty cruelties. Julian was nothing now, the lowest of the low, and yet he couldn't seem to divert his attention from him. Moreover, while Julian performed the most demeaning tasks, he never displayed the subservient, broken demeanor Ethan wished to see. According to the guards, he remained distant, almost silent, carrying himself with an air of cold hauteur. A man like that could never have an easy life. Julian, who had been born to inherit this empire, could never comprehend the price Ethan had paid just to climb a single rung on the ladder, just to grasp at his ambitions. Because Julian had always been at the top. As winter began to relent, Ethan was returning from his early morning workout when he encountered Julian on a path in the private gardens of the main house. It was still dawn. Julian stood by the side of the path, clearly waiting for him. He said Ethan's name. Ethan stared at him, his voice like ice as he demanded to know what he was doing there and who had let him in. The thought that someone still dared to help Julian was an irritating pebble in his shoe. It meant Julian's life wasn't as miserable as it should be. Julian seemed to be choosing his words carefully, or perhaps he was simply remembering that Ethan was now the master. He gave a formal, slight bow. He explained that he had slipped in himself and would accept the punishment afterward, assuring Ethan that the guards on duty had been diligent and were not to be blamed. Ethan scoffed, remarking on how readily Julian spoke of punishment. He demanded to know what he wanted. Julian said he wished to see Leo. The child had been so ill when they arrived, and not having seen him since, he was deeply worried. His voice carried an unmistakable note of pleading. Ethan had been waiting for this plea for a long time and had no intention of letting the opportunity pass. A smile played on his lips. He asked if Julian wanted to see him. Julian's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope, and he affirmed that just one look would be enough. Ethan's smile widened. He mused aloud that if he were to grant Julian's wish now, who had ever granted his wishes in the past? He told him to forget it. Whether the boy was sick or well, alive or dead, he would never let Julian see him. Julian's expression shifted from disbelief to a kind of resigned certainty, as if he had expected this. He said that Leo was just a child, and that he knew nothing of what had passed between them. His voice was laced with bitterness as he added that Ethan was not the kind of man to take his grudges out on a child. So why must he be this way? Ethan shook his head and paced a few steps, his hands clasped behind his back. He countered that he had no intention of visiting the father's sins upon the son. However, since he had saved the boy's life, that life now belonged to him. It had nothing to do with Julian anymore, so there was no need for them to meet. He added, with a note of triumphant cruelty, that Julian's brief foray into marriage and fatherhood had all been for nothing. He warmed to his theme, wondering aloud. The boy was only 4, still young and impressionable. By the time he completely forgot Julian, and Julian himself was a broken wreck, even if Ethan allowed them to meet, the boy wouldn't spare him a second glance. He wouldn't recognize him. He would only see Ethan as his family. And then, when Ethan had children of his own, Leo would serve them his entire life, a loyal attendant. It would be perfect. Based on his knowledge of Julian, and Julian's deep love for his wife and child, Ethan knew these words should have driven him into a rage. But Julian did not lash out. He simply raised his eyes and looked at Ethan in silence. It was only then that Ethan truly noticed how much he had deteriorated in the time since he'd last seen him up close. He was skeletal, his clothes hanging off his frame. Ethan found himself reaching out, his hand landing on Julian's shoulder. The moment he realized what he was doing, he recoiled, shoving him away with disgust. Julian staggered back a few steps and said in a low voice that now he knew that Ethan truly hated him. He confessed that he had been waiting, hoping that one day, when Ethan's anger had cooled, he would be willing to sit down and listen to his explanation. He said it seemed that day would never come. But perhaps, he added, that was for the best. He turned and walked a few steps, then looked back over his shoulder. He asked Ethan to please take care of Leo. He said that the boy was young and would grow to love whoever was kind to him and would always be obedient. He then asked him, for the sake of what they once shared, to treat him well. Hearing that last phrase, Ethan stood frozen, on the verge of laughing from sheer rage. Julian still had the audacity to bring up the past. He snarled at him to stop. Julian paused but did not turn back. He merely said that he had entered the grounds without permission and was now going to receive his punishment. With that, he walked away, leaving Ethan seething in the cold morning air. The rules at Ironwood under Ethan's command were strict. The penalty for trespassing in the main compound was between 10 and 30 lashes with a belt. The head of security, upon learning the offender was Julian, felt his authority had been challenged and, without hesitation, decreed the maximum of 30. Seeking to curry favor, he came to Ethan for formal confirmation. Ethan, still fuming, ordered that the guards who had been on duty should administer the punishment, and then receive 10 lashes themselves. But as the man nodded and left to carry out the order, Ethan felt a strange unease. He remembered the feeling of Julian's shoulder under his hand, how cold and frail it had felt. Julian must have been waiting out there for a long time. Getting into the inner grounds must have been difficult. Ethan almost called the man back to tell him to go easy. But then he looked around at the faces of his staff. They all wore expressions of perfect understanding, as if his order was the most natural thing in the world. And it was. Everyone knew he despised Julian. Everyone knew he sought any excuse to torment him. And Julian did nothing but endure it. If not for his son, he wouldn't have even spoken a word to him. A sense of frustration washed over Ethan again. It felt as if he were the only one caught in this endless struggle. He possessed everything most people could only dream of, yet he felt a profound emptiness, an almost pathetic void. How had it come to this? He swallowed the words that had risen to his tongue and turned away. Perhaps what the mind dwells on by day, it relives by night. That evening, Ethan's sleep was a maelstrom of chaotic dreams, all of them featuring Julian. In the dream, Julian asked him why he wouldn't just listen to his explanation. He looked heartbroken, still wearing the tattered, poorly mended clothes from that morning. Yet he appeared as he had in his youth, unreachably elegant, his beauty flawless, his eyes clear of the world's dust. Then came the past, scene after scene, an unfolding scroll of memories. Ethan's family had been prominent in their Midwestern city, but he had been born into its decline. By the time he was 9, his parents were dead and the fortune was gone. He came to Ironwood, then the Hayes estate with his uncle. Having lost his home and family, the young Ethan already had watchful, resentful eyes and a precociously sensitive soul. His uncle was the estate manager, and so Ethan had to leave his old life behind for this remote mountain fortress. Ethan never forgot his first sight of Julian. His uncle led him through a series of grand, stone-arched foyers and down a long gallery. Standing there was a boy his own age and height, his face like carved porcelain, his eyes dark and translucent as obsidian. The boy's father, the formidable patriarch of the Hayes family, was a shrewd and powerful man. He had looked at Ethan and seen a boy with great potential but an unwillingness to submit to others. He had intended to assign him to menial tasks in the outer buildings. But at that crucial moment, Julian had pointed at Ethan and said he wanted him. The patriarch doted on his only son, so Ethan became Julian's companion, his shadow, his playmate. When Julian had his tutors, Ethan listened in, ready to take any punishments meant for him. When Julian trained in his various physical disciplines, Ethan stood by with a towel. When Julian rode his horses, Ethan ran behind. The position earned him no small amount of envy and resentment, a burden Ethan bore in silence. But he understood that Julian was the future master of this place. Being his companion was a path to a future, a position many coveted. Ethan needed a future, even if it wasn't one he truly desired. It was the best he could hope for. Fortunately, his uncle was the manager. Ethan carefully navigated his relationships, earning favor and support where he could, slowly securing his position, presenting a subservient face to the patriarch, and diligently serving Julian. After some time, the patriarch, seeing he was a fixture at his son's side, arranged for him to receive some basic training as well. Ethan discovered a hunger for it. Perhaps because only in the discipline of practice could he feel a sense of control over his own destiny. But he had started late and his training was rudimentary. Whenever he saw Julian moving with effortless grace through complex routines, he felt a sting of inadequacy. One night, he was in a secluded corner of the grounds, trying to replicate Julian's techniques from memory, when a figure in white appeared. Julian was standing there, arms crossed, watching him with a blank expression. He told Ethan he could practice for 100 years and never learn it that way. The words were a blow, but Julian's next sentence made him stare. But he had said, "I can teach you." After that night, Ethan was introduced to a world of advanced techniques and strategies he'd never known existed. Julian, with his usual impassive face, shared the secrets of his family's rigorously guarded training methods as if they were common knowledge. There were other unspoken kindnesses: extra fuel for his heater in winter, new clothes in spring, quiet walks together in the gardens at night, the sound of medicine simmering on the stove when he was sick. The aloof, quiet Julian had warmed Ethan's heart. Before he knew it, Julian was his entire world. And as time went on, Julian only grew more captivating. Ethan knew Julian was engaged to a Miss Amelia Davenport, a woman said to be his equal in beauty, grace, and intelligence. He did his best to cage the beast stirring in his heart, to be a loyal companion, and he thought he could live that way forever. When they were 17, Julian got his father's permission for them to travel. They set out like young princes, full of life. It was spring in the south, and New Orleans was draped in a soft mist. They explored the city without a plan, becoming part of its painted scenery. Ethan was handsome enough, but when they were together, all eyes were on Julian. And Ethan began to realize that while many sought Julian's attention, Julian's eyes seemed to see only him. In those days, the vibrant colors of the South and the humid air seemed to bleed together with the softness of Julian's lips and the heat of his embrace. He had discovered a passionate, tender side to Julian he never knew existed. Everything seemed worth it. They lingered there, reluctant to leave, then traveled up the Mississippi. Even now, with everything changed, Ethan could not deny that it had been the best time of his life. Back at the estate, they were as they had been, only now with a new layer of caution. Until one day, Julian gave him a mission: deliver a message to Marcus Thorne, the head of a rival organization known as the Syndicate, and while there, investigate whether they were developing a new piece of financial software codenamed Red Cloud, and if possible, steal the source code. Julian was uncharacteristically troubled that day. He spoke little of the mission itself, focusing instead on Ethan's safety, repeatedly urging him to be careful and to return immediately if he encountered any difficulty. Ethan accepted eagerly. He was young, confident in his abilities, and understood the implications of the task. He felt he needed to achieve something significant to justify his place at Julian's side. He was full of hope. That evening, Julian had arranged an elaborate dinner. He rarely drank, but they shared a bottle of wine, and he became slightly flushed. He held onto Ethan, refusing to let go, until Ethan half carried him to bed, where he still clung to his sleeve. When Ethan departed, though he knew it would be a short separation, he felt a profound reluctance to leave. Ethan delivered the message to the Syndicate. That night, he broke into Thorne's office. He found the files but tripped a silent alarm. He was quickly surrounded by guards and a fight broke out. In the middle of the struggle, he suddenly felt his strength vanish, a strange emptiness where his power should have been. He was easily captured. During the interrogations that followed, Ethan said nothing, careful not to antagonize his captors too much. He was sure Julian would come for him. He just had to stay alive. But his strength did not return. He suspected he had been exposed to some kind of neurotoxin while accessing the files. Even without harsh treatment, he grew progressively weaker. Marcus Thorne himself came to see him. He looked at Ethan's defiant face and shook his head. He had been about to contact the Hayes family to ransom him back, he said, but it turned out their heir was about to be married. They were far too busy to be concerned with him. Julian's father had already replied to his message. He had denied ordering the mission and told Thorne to deal with the captured agent as he saw fit. Julian was getting married? He had been abandoned? The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. Remembering Julian's tender farewell, he gritted his teeth and insisted he didn't believe a word of it. Thorne's expression held a strange mix of admiration and pity. He informed Ethan that his nervous system had been permanently damaged, that he would be weaker than an ordinary man for the rest of his life, so why would he bother lying? As he was leaving, he remarked on how foolish Ethan had been, a kid coming in alone without any backup. Poisoned? No backup. Had Julian truly abandoned him? Even if he was getting married, he wouldn't have needed to poison him. There had to be a mistake. In the dark cell, Ethan bit his lip until it bled. A few days later, the syndicate released him. Thorne sent a message saying he had no interest in being used as a weapon in someone else's game. He also expressed his sympathy and said that if Ethan ever needed a place, the syndicate might have one for him. Ethan was too preoccupied to wonder about Thorne's unusual interest in him. His mind was consumed with questions and the news of Julian's wedding. He had to get back to the estate, but he was weak and fell ill on the journey. By the time he was well enough to travel again, the wedding was over. Julian was a married man. When he finally returned to the estate, the first person he saw was his uncle, who could only sigh and settle him in a small, remote cottage on the grounds. He was told that the young master had heard he was still unwell and wanted him to rest before returning to his duties. He couldn't even get into the main house, let alone see Julian. A few days later, his uncle was dismissed from his position over a fabricated error. He and his family had to move into the small cottage with Ethan. One day to the next, his world had been turned upside down. Ethan tasted the bitterness of fickle fortunes and learned what it meant to have nothing. He thought he had possessed so much, but it was all an illusion. When the master of the house took back what he had given, Ethan was left with nothing. Not even his health. He was prone to exhaustion and fevers. And it had all happened without explanation, without reason, a simple, brutal fact. One night, Ethan waited for a gap in the guard's patrol and slipped over the wall into the inner gardens. Even if it was all a misunderstanding, he knew things could never go back to the way they were. But the doubt and pain were a fire in his heart, robbing him of sleep. Julian owed him an explanation. It was a cold winter night, and the lights were on in Julian's residential wing. Ethan circled the building, using his knowledge of the grounds and patrol routes to avoid detection. He found a side gate that was usually locked left open and cautiously went inside. He found Julian in his study, quietly writing at his desk. By his side, instead of Ethan, was an elegantly beautiful woman, pouring wine from a silver carafe into a golden cup. It was his new wife, Amelia Davenport. Julian saw Ethan and showed no surprise. Without asking Amelia to leave, he told Ethan calmly that it was time for him to marry. He explained that sending Ethan away had been partly to give them some distance, given their history. He spoke of their time together as a youthful folly that could never have lasted. He said that now he had a family and regretted his past actions. He told Ethan it was no longer appropriate for him to be his companion. He should rest and recover, and he would be given a generous sum of money to start a new life. He pushed a cup of wine toward him. He said that Ethan was a man, and that after drinking this cup, there would be nothing between them. Amelia simply listened with a placid smile, the picture of serene composure. Ethan was stunned. Julian was always reserved, but this cold, cruel version of him was a stranger. Every word was a shard of ice, slicing away at the affection in Ethan's heart. This was real. He meant it. He truly didn't care. Ethan's vision blurred. He picked up the cup, his hand trembling as he drank. He asked, his voice hollow, if Julian knew he'd been poisoned, that he'd lost everything, that he'd nearly died. Julian merely raised an eyebrow, a sign of his impatience. He chided Ethan for being careless, reminding him that he had told him to return if the mission proved difficult. He said there was nothing he could do about it now. He called Ethan impulsive, not suited for important work, and lamented that he had wasted years of effort on him. Ethan didn't know how he left. He only knew that Julian, who had once been his entire world, had just destroyed that world with a few casual words. It had been so easy, and from that, hatred was born. Perhaps fueled by that hatred, Ethan forced himself to recover. After a few days, feeling some of his strength return, he left the estate with his uncle's family, refusing Julian's money. He was still young. He would go back to the city and start over. But after several days on the road, they were attacked by highwaymen. Ethan had never felt so helpless. He watched as blades plunged into his uncle and aunt, as the blood of his last remaining family soaked into the ground. He felt the cold, sharp pain of the steel in his own flesh. As he tumbled down a ravine, he knew that if he survived, he would no longer be the same Ethan. That Ethan had been too foolish, too trusting, too quick to offer his heart to be trampled. The attackers had been disguised, but Ethan could tell from their precise movements that they were highly trained professionals. Why this relentless persecution? Why did they want him dead? What happened after that was a blur. In Ethan's memory, the most vivid pain was always, and only, associated with Julian. Ethan was young and, despite his severe injuries, he survived. He hid his trail, traveling by night, and finally made it to the syndicate's headquarters, where he asked to see Marcus Thorne. Thorne saw Ethan's potential and the unique circumstances of having developed and then lost his formidable skills. It made him a perfect candidate for the syndicate's most advanced training regimen, a brutal program that required the complete destruction of one's previous abilities before building them anew, allowing for unprecedented growth. Thorne needed a willing and suitable protege. Ethan agreed to be his student on the sole condition that he would not formally join the syndicate. He had a vendetta to pursue and could not be tied down. Halfway through his training, Ethan heard that Julian's father had been financially ruined in a corporate battle with a rival, Larkin Industries, and had died from the resulting stress. Julian had formally taken over what was left of the Hayes Empire. The news barely registered with Ethan. He thought of the powerful patriarch, a man who had loomed over his youth like a storm cloud, and realized he too could lose, could be broken, could die. This was the world he lived in. Success and failure were determined by strength alone. So there was still a chance to reclaim what was taken from him, to build his own world. Fueled by this drive, Ethan's progress astonished even Thorne. He had found a worthy investment. When Ethan had completed the 7th stage of his training, he was a formidable force, far more powerful than he had ever been. He then received 2 pieces of news. Julian had issued a public challenge to Larkin, seeking revenge for his father, and Amelia was pregnant. Ethan took his leave of Thorne. He was grateful to the man who had, in his own way, saved him. But now he needed to settle old scores. The showdown between Julian and Larkin was set for August 15th, at noon, at the foot of the mountain where the estate stood. Ethan arrived the night before. With his new skills, infiltrating Ironwood was child's play. Julian had moved into his father's old quarters. Amelia, likely due to her advanced pregnancy, was not living with him. Ethan found him sitting alone at a table, drinking. When Julian saw him, he shot to his feet, nearly knocking over the bottle, his eyes shining with a strange light. He said that he had thought Ethan was dead. So Ethan thought with a cold smile in his mind, I was supposed to be dead. He attacked without a word. Julian just stared at him, lost in thought, and was easily subdued. Years had passed. He was thinner, but his features were the same, his grace even more pronounced than before. Ethan thought of the young man he had once been, who had willingly submitted to this person, and sneered. He asked how, in his current state, Julian expected to win against a corporate shark like Larkin. Julian just looked at him, saying nothing. Ethan extinguished the lamp, tore open Julian's shirt, and bit down inch by inch. The moonlight was soft and poetic, but all Ethan felt was a long-suppressed violence and a deep, cold desolation. Julian was completely pliant. Even when Ethan, bored, released him from his hold, he didn't resist. He even reached out tentatively to hold Ethan's back, trying to please him. At dawn, Julian was unconscious. As Ethan dressed to leave, he saw that the bed was stained with large patches of blood, still wet. He thought of the blood flowing from his aunt and uncle, turned his head, and vaulted out the window. At the public showdown that day, a high-stakes board meeting, Julian arrived a few minutes late. He looked tired but otherwise normal. It was only when the proceedings began that the assembled spectators noticed his movements were sluggish, as if he were injured. Larkin, knowing the feud with the Hayes family was irreconcilable after his destruction of the patriarch, saw Julian's weakness and showed no mercy, intending to crush him completely. Ethan watched from the sidelines. When he saw Julian take 2 major blows in the negotiations and saw Larkin pressing his advantage, he couldn't stop himself. He made an anonymous call, feeding a piece of damning information about Larkin to a financial reporter in the room. The ensuing chaos disrupted Larkin's momentum. The final, crushing blow he had intended for Julian's company was deflected, landing instead as a less fatal, but still crippling, hit to its core assets. Ethan strode into the room, steadied the swaying Julian, and announced coolly that the contest was over. He knew that Larkin's move, though blunted, had shattered the foundations of Julian's company. He would never recover. He was no longer a player in their world, just a man with a name, perhaps not even as well off as an ordinary person. Blood trickled from the corner of Julian's mouth. He had time for one look at Ethan before he lost consciousness. Ethan gently laid him aside and addressed the room, his voice ringing with authority. He introduced himself as an associate of Mr. Hayes and proceeded to systematically dismantle Larkin's own company with a series of moves identical to those Julian had just attempted, but executed with brutal perfection. In a single battle, Larkin was financially annihilated. Ethan, with his power and ruthlessness, made a name for himself that day. People wondered where Julian had found such a formidable ally. Ethan returned to Ironwood with Julian, ostensibly as his subordinate. The situation at the estate changed rapidly. 2 months later, when Julian was able to walk again, Amelia gave birth to a son, but her health failed, and she passed away soon after. By then, Ethan was the one truly in charge. Julian held the tiny infant and named him Leo. He became a recluse, seeing no one but his son, taking no interest in the affairs of the world. On the rare nights Ethan came to him, he was impassive, neither welcoming nor rejecting him. When Leo turned 1, Ethan threw them out of Ironwood, forbidding Julian from leaving the immediate area. Julian found shelter in a small, dilapidated cabin, leaving the baby with a woman in a nearby village during the day while he sold firewood to survive, sometimes earning extra by writing letters for the illiterate. Ethan couldn't imagine Julian selling firewood, but when he saw it for himself, he felt no satisfaction. Julian still carried himself with a quiet dignity. He wasn't broken. Perhaps the child gave him the strength to go on. Looking back, despite every setback, despite being cast out, Julian had never complained, never panicked. What Ethan needed was to see him truly bow his head, lose everything, and crawl in the mud, just as he himself had once done. He wouldn't stoop to stealing an infant. He could wait. He would wait for the day Julian had no other choice, for the day he would kneel at the gate and beg. And then he would return all the pain, the despair, the deceit, and the betrayal. Ethan woke from the chaotic dream with a headache and a sense of exhaustion. From age 10 to 27, his life had revolved around Julian. He had either loved him or hated him. Now, Julian had knelt before him, been possessed by him, and was washing his clothes and chopping his wood every day. So why did he still feel so unsatisfied, so steeped in this profound, aching emptiness? He didn't understand. After breakfast, his mind still in turmoil, he did something unusual and ordered Julian to be brought to him. The guard was gone for a long time. Just as Ethan's patience was wearing thin, the man returned and stood before him, head bowed. He reported that Julian was not in his room. It seemed he had tried to escape during the night. He dared to run away. Ethan shot to his feet, blood rushing to his head. He strode toward the door, yelling at the guard to find him, that he couldn't have gone far. The guard remained frozen in place. He stammered that they had already found him. Where? Ethan stopped, demanding that he be locked up. The guard hesitated, then explained that it wouldn't be necessary. After the lashing, he hadn't made it off the grounds. He had collapsed in the old apple orchard and lain in the snow for half the night. When they found him a short while ago, he was barely breathing. It looked like he wasn't going to make it. Not going to make it. The blood that had rushed to Ethan's head seemed to congeal. It meant he was dying. The unfortunate guard, feeling the oppressive weight of Ethan's silent fury, braced himself and loudly confirmed the obvious. Dead? Ethan suddenly remembered what Julian had said the day before. It seems that day will never come. And the 30 lashes. Where was he now? He ordered the estate's doctor to be sent immediately, and for others to be summoned from the city, the very best. He strode out the door, a chilling cold seeping into his bones. Took him a moment to realize what he was feeling. It was fear. The passing years, and the dream from last night, seemed to have eroded his hatred. He found he could no longer be indifferent to Julian's suffering. Julian had been taken back to his miserable little room. When Ethan entered, the first thing he saw was Julian's face, as white as paper. His dark hair was splayed across the pillow, lifeless and dull. In his memory, Julian's hair was like black silk, lustrous and soft, something his hands had loved to tangle in. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and took his wrist. The pulse beneath his fingers was terrifyingly slow and weak, a fragile thread about to snap. Ethan had never thought Julian would die. He had never intended for him to die. But he realized he had never considered that for Julian, who had already lost his father, his skills, and the family he was meant to have. Ethan's deliberate and unintentional vengeance might actually kill him. Julian was beautiful, proud, and aloof, but he was still just a man. Perhaps these past years, he hadn't been as composed as he appeared. Perhaps he had just been holding on by a thread. People came and went, but Ethan just stared, lost in thought. After a while, he became aware of how cold the room was. The wind whistling through the cracks, the blanket on the bed far too thin. When he lifted the blanket to pick Julian up, he saw he was still wearing the tattered clothes from the day before, stiff with dried, blackened blood that had stuck to his skin. A sharp, wrenching pain shot through Ethan's chest. He almost shouted, demanding to know who had beaten him so badly, but then he remembered. He had not only approved the punishment, he had implied it should be severe. The body in his arms was cold and unervingly light, as if life could depart at any moment. He took a deep breath to steady himself and gave the order to bring out the estate's entire supply of emergency medical stimulants, to set up heaters in his own bedroom, and for the doctors to go there at once. Ethan's staff exchanged bewildered glances. Before they could acknowledge the command, they saw their famously impassive, unpredictable master leap into motion, carrying Julian in his arms as he disappeared across the snow-covered rooftops like a phantom. Julian was placed in Ethan's bed, in the master suite that had once been his own. His wounds were cleaned and dressed, but he remained unconscious. 3 different doctors were brought in. After examining him, they all shook their heads, murmuring grim phrases about systemic failure, deep-seated emotional trauma, and a body that had simply run out of energy. The consensus was that he would not survive. Ethan sat by the bed. He forced a vial of potent stimulant between Julian's lips, drop by drop. When it was done, there was still no color in Julian's face. He lay perfectly still. The mark on his cheek from Ethan's wrench was almost healed, leaving only a faint scar, like a teardrop that had not yet faded. Ethan traced it with his finger. Julian was so thin. At least in the warm room, his skin wasn't so cold to the touch. He went to tuck Julian's hand under the covers and saw that it was swollen and misshapen, covered in chilblains and cuts, from washing laundry every day in the freezing well water. Ethan clasped the hand between his own. He remembered them riding side by side through the misty New Orleans streets, Julian rising from their table in the jazz club, his eyes full of shimmering light. A quiet place to listen to the spring rain all night. So many years had passed. Even his heart had grown weary and old. When would they ever find that quiet place again? He gritted his teeth and leaned down, whispering in Julian's ear. He said that Julian had wanted him to sit and listen, to hear his explanation. He was sitting now. He told him to explain, that he would believe anything he said. He said this was his only chance, that he owed him an explanation. He told him that for all these years, he had been living in agony, and it was all his fault. Why did it have to come to this? Julian lay motionless. And in that moment, Ethan finally understood why he had been in such pain for so long, why he had hated so deeply. Because he could not bear the thought that Julian didn't love him. The pain and cold of that abandonment had been a permanent fixture in his soul, a wound that never healed. He couldn't stand it. Everything he had done was just to make Julian notice him, value him, love him. But now Julian was dying. The subordinate sent to fetch the city doctors returned with an unexpected guest. And his expression was one of someone who had just won the lottery. The man was Dr. Miles Corbin, the head of a cutting-edge biotech firm. Though young, Corbin was a genius in his field, and his medical expertise was legendary. He was in the area partly for a ski trip, and partly to consult with Ethan on a new business venture. Corbin knew Ethan and had a passing acquaintance with Julian, but as a CEO, his priority was fostering relationships with powerful figures like Ethan. He listened to the subordinate's description of the situation and immediately went to Ethan's quarters. There, he saw the formidable master of Ironwood, a man known for his ruthlessness, sitting by a sickbed, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Seeing this, Corbin cleared his throat, abandoned his planned business pleasantries, and became a doctor. He treated Ethan not as a business partner, but as the family of a patient. He walked over and told him bluntly to move, that if he wanted the man to live, he needed to get out of the way so he could work. He took Julian's pulse, then methodically began to unbutton his shirt. Ethan, standing to the side, instinctively recoiled, asking what he was doing. Corbin replied, annoyed, that he needed to use acupuncture. He explained that the man's system was in chaos, energy depleted, temperature fluctuating wildly, meridians blocked. He said he had to stabilize his vitals before he could even think about a treatment plan. Ethan heard only what he wanted to hear, asking if that meant there was a chance. Corbin replied that it was not guaranteed. The patient had no will to live. He opened his medical kit and took out a set of sterile needles, then remembered he needed alcohol to sterilize the skin. He turned and saw that Ethan's face was now as pale as the man on the bed. Taking pity on him, he offered a sliver of reassurance. As long as he was here, he said, the man wouldn't die so easily. He added that if the patient had any close family, they should be brought in after he finished the treatment. And so, 3 days later, when Julian awoke, the first thing he saw was the small, perfect face of his son, Leo. The boy had clearly been well cared for, his cheeks round and full, though his beautiful dark eyes were red from crying. He whispered, "Daddy." Then Julian saw Ethan, his face grim, his own eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. He spoke to Julian with harsh intensity, asking if he thought he could run, snarling that he would never be free of the debt he owed him. But his hand, clutching Julian's, did not let go. Julian closed his eyes wearily. He was still too weak to sit up. He could feel Ethan's hand, hot and cold by turns, trembling slightly. He was obviously overwhelmed with emotion. Julian frowned slightly but did not try to pull his hand away. He lay quietly in the bed, and gradually, a little color returned to his face. Dr. Corbin stayed at Ironwood for some time. When he saw his patient was on the mend, he left 2 prescriptions and departed. Ethan now owed him a massive favor, which Corbin had leveraged into a very lucrative business deal. Satisfied with saving a life and securing his company's future, he offered some parting advice. He told Ethan that Julian had been suffering for years and surely had deep emotional wounds. A sick heart needs a special kind of medicine. He pointed out that Ethan had been master of Ironwood for 3 years now, and perhaps it was time he made some time to talk with him. The meaning was clear. You stole his position and his life, and then you abused him. If you want him to truly recover, you're going to have to do some consoling. In the following days, though Julian's physical health improved, and he would even smile when Leo was with him, he remained mostly silent. He would spend hours just staring out the window at the sky, lost in thought. Even if Ethan wanted to console him, he had to get him to speak first. He had to find a way. A wry, sad smile touched Ethan's lips. He himself had been suffering for years. But after this, he truly wanted to let it all go. He needed Julian, and Julian was alive, here with him. If he could just treat him right, perhaps his own broken life could be made whole. After much planning, Ethan chose wine. For Julian's health, he used a special fortified wine that Corbin had arranged to be sent over. A potent but pleasant-tasting concoction. It was early spring, and the plum trees outside the main house were in bloom. Taking advantage of the warm afternoon sun, Ethan had a chaise lounge on the veranda piled high with soft blankets and pillows. He wrapped Julian up warmly and carried him outside to enjoy the flowers and the wine. To create a distraction, he brought Leo out to play nearby. The air was filled with the sweet scent of blossoms. While pretending to help Leo with his recitation homework, Ethan discreetly kept refilling Julian's glass. Leo, having been told that for every poem he got right, the master would have to drink a glass, and for every line he got wrong, his own father would, summoned all his intellectual might, determined not to make a single mistake. Unfortunately, he was too young and had been an inattentive student. In 5 poems, he made 7 mistakes. Julian, still weak, drank the small glasses one after another, lulled by the sound of his son's voice. He soon lost track of how much he'd had. A flush crept into his cheeks and his body felt heavy. Seeing that he was sufficiently relaxed, Ethan sent the teary-eyed Leo back inside with his nanny and sat down on the chaise lounge beside him. He asked Julian to tell him what happened all those years ago. He wanted to know what Julian had been thinking, why he sent him to the syndicate, why he had been poisoned, and why someone had tried to kill him. He gently touched Julian's face. He promised that no matter what Julian had done, he would forgive him. And Julian had to forgive him, too. And after today, it would all be in the past. He saw Julian flinch, saw that familiar, dazed look of disbelief in his eyes, and felt a pang of sorrow. He insisted he was being serious, that they had grown up together, and that Julian should trust him this one time. Julian's expression was hazy. He reached for the wine glass again and drained it. He murmured that there was nothing to say about the past, that it was his fault, he was useless and had messed everything up. He reached for the bottle, but Ethan gently stopped him. He asked why Julian had sent him to steal the code from the syndicate. Julian gave a small, sad smile and said that as they both knew now, the theft was just a pretense. Ethan pressed, asking what the real reason was. Julian began to speak, his voice slow. He recounted going to his father to tell him he was in love with someone else and wanted to break his engagement to Amelia. He had expected his father to be furious, had been prepared for a beating. His father had been enraged, but he hadn't struck him. He had said he couldn't believe how foolish Julian had become, and that it was all Ethan's fault. He said Ethan had stolen the family's secrets and led his son down a dark path, and that he could not be allowed to remain. Julian said he had thought he'd hidden their relationship and the secret training so well, but his father had known everything. He had panicked. His father then revealed that he had known about Ethan's stealing of their techniques for years and had taken precautions. He had been slowly poisoning Ethan, and without an antidote, he would not live to see his 20th birthday. Julian's voice grew quiet. He said his father had described certain symptoms, and they matched things Julian had noticed about Ethan's health, so he had to believe him. He had broken down, admitting he had taught Ethan everything, that their relationship was his doing, and begged for the antidote. His father had finally agreed, but with conditions. They had to be separated immediately. He gave Julian half the antidote and sent Ethan to the syndicate, promising the other half when the mission was complete. and Julian had to marry Amelia without delay. He had believed him. He had secretly given Ethan the first half of the antidote and sent him away. Ethan nodded, remembering the circumstances of his departure. Julian's behavior then made perfect sense now. He also recalled occasional dizzy spells over the years, which he had always dismissed as poor health. Julian continued. He said that after Ethan left, there was no word. The men he had sent as backup also vanished. He had been about to go after Ethan himself, but his father had him placed under house arrest and began preparing for the wedding. By then, he no longer trusted him, but he saw no other way out, so he went on a hunger strike. He told his father that if he didn't see Ethan return, safe and sound, the Davenports would receive his corpse. That was when his father had written the letter to the syndicate. Ethan thought of Marcus Thorne's words. Julian couldn't know that the letter had been a death sentence. Julian said that once he saw the letter had been sent, he resumed eating. But the water he was given was drugged. He was in a stupor for days. His father told everyone he was ill and used a proxy to stand in for him at the wedding ceremony. He was married to Amelia. Then Ethan had returned, sick, his abilities gone. Julian had managed to overhear his father talking with Amelia and learned the truth. The antidote he'd given Ethan had been laced with a slow-acting paralytic agent. Not only would his skills never recover, but the poison in his system would accumulate, and he would be dead within a few years. Ethan broke out in a cold sweat. He was no longer the naive boy of the past. What Julian was saying sounded fantastical, but upon reflection, it was entirely plausible. He saw how labored Julian's breathing had become, how sweat beaded on his forehead, and he pulled him into an embrace. He told him it was all right, that he had been wrong to blame him, that he didn't have to say any more. Julian's lips curved in a bleak smile. He said it was only natural for Ethan to blame him. None of it was what he wanted, but it had all happened because of him. His mistake, he said, was in his ignorance of his own powerlessness. He had wanted to possess without having the ability to protect. He lacked cunning, lacked foresight, and had never truly understood the kind of man his own father was. Once he knew the situation, he realized he was outmatched. The only way to save Ethan's life was to get the real antidote and get him away. This time, he made a deal with Amelia. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he had to take the gamble. His voice was steady, but his eyes were unfocused. After the wedding, he had refused to touch her, had ignored her. But she had been kind to him. She was a prominent woman in the prime of her life, and he could sense what she wanted. So he had promised her that if she helped him get the antidote and ensured Ethan's safe departure, he would sever all ties with him and be the husband she deserved, raise a family with her and never look back. And she had gotten it. This time, he had tested it himself and guarded it closely. The night Ethan came to his study, the antidote had been in the wine he offered him. So Ethan realized the men who had attacked him and his family on the road hadn't been sent by Julian. He thought of that night of finality, of Amelia pouring the wine, of Julian's devastating words. It was her, Julian said quietly. After that, he had tried to keep his promise, but he couldn't. He was always distracted, plagued by nightmares of something terrible happening to Ethan. All of it his fault. After a few months, Amelia couldn't take it anymore. One night, she had shaken him awake, begging him to stop calling out Ethan's name in his sleep. She told him Ethan was dead. After that, they had lived in separate rooms and never spoke again. Ethan found himself asking a question he knew was inappropriate, but he couldn't stop himself. He asked about Leo. Julian had been married for several years by then. A faint blush appeared on Julian's pale face. He was quiet for a moment before answering. She had drugged him. He picked up the wine bottle, filled his glass, and drank it down in one gulp, spilling some on his clothes. He said he had been cold to her, always. He thought that perhaps her death after childbirth, her deep depression, was partly his fault. He said that he had once been so arrogant, so sure he could do anything, that he could make Ethan happy. But in reality, he was useless. He couldn't make anyone happy. He couldn't even take care of his own child. He looked at Ethan. He said that what mattered was that Ethan was still alive. At the showdown with Larkin, he had been planning to take them both down, a final, destructive act. But then Ethan had appeared. His voice grew softer and softer, until his hand went slack. The glass fell to the ground, and he slumped against Ethan. The scent of plum blossoms drifted on the air, mingling with the aromas of wine and medicine. It was a fragrance that was at once pure, intoxicating, and faintly bitter, just like Julian himself. Julian's eyes were closed, his sleep deep and peaceful. Whether it was the fortified wine or the unburdening of years of secrets, the tension in his brow had smoothed away, his breathing even and steady. Ethan sighed deeply and couldn't resist kissing his lips. He whispered that Julian was truly an idiot. He lifted the sleeping man into his arms and carried him back inside. He felt that because of the person in his arms, his heart was finally full. The feeling was solid and comforting, tinged with a tender joy. Actually, he thought he wasn't that much of an idiot. We were both just too young back then, too naive. We misjudged your father, the inscrutable patriarch. We underestimated his iron will, his self-righteousness, and the swiftness of his cruelty. So often, the deepest wounds come not from our enemies, but from those closest to us. Only they have the power to destroy our hopes, to rip our happiness out by the roots. It is a pain inflicted in the name of love, a pain that goes bone deep, beyond anyone's imagining, a pain from which there is no recovery. But who can understand that before it happens? I know you were hurt, badly hurt. I know you suffered so much. But Julian, you have to know, in my heart, you are the only one I have ever loved. You are my family. So the pain you gave me was of that same magnitude. So you owe me a great deal. But you are here, and I am here, and now I know you have me in your heart. I will give you a warm home. I will help you heal. And so you must stay with me, and let me find my happiness again. When Julian woke, the sun was setting. He turned his head and found Ethan lying beside him, watching him without blinking, a faint smile on his handsome, youthful face. It took him a moment to remember the wine-fueled confession of the afternoon. He had poured out years of accumulated sorrow and then simply fallen asleep, without even knowing what Ethan thought of it all. He said Ethan's name, his voice full of apprehension. Ethan pulled him close and kissed him gently. He said that he knew everything now, and that it was all over. He told him he was tired, and that he would stay with him while he slept a little longer. After a moment, Julian felt his hand being taken under the blankets, and then he was pulled into a full embrace. He heard Ethan whisper softly in his ear. He said, "Julian, when you are better, let's go back to New Orleans." "Yes."